Hello, this is the CUDAN Open Lab seminar on December 1, 2025. And today is the begin of a really strong end of the semester. We will have Oleg Sobchuk from the Max-Planck-Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany. And he will talk about evolution of literature and the arts. And let me just say a bunch of sentences. So he just obtained an ERC starting grant, so congratulations for that. You will not be the last one this semester who has one of those. So next week, Corina Kopet will show up in person here in Tallinn. And then I also like to announce we will have another Open Lab seminar at the University of Amsterdam, where in the business school, they also do cultural data analytics. So we will look at CIX labs, and that will happen there. So the next 3 Mondays, including this one, we'll set to have 3 Open Lab seminars before Christmas. Oleg, the stage is yours. It is our greatest pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me because I've been hearing about your lab a lot, and I know several members of your lab very well. So it's a pleasure to give a talk. Yes. So the title is Evolution of Literature and the Arts, and a couple of words about me. As you have rightly said, I work at the MPI for Evolutionary Anthropology, but pretty soon I will move to a different venue. I'll be working in Frankfurt at the Max-Planck-Institute for Empirical Aesthetics. For those of you who don't know what this is, the idea is that let's study arts using some quantitative methods and try to get more or less objective picture as much as possible of how arts influence our brain and how arts are changing over time. And there I'll be starting a new group, which actually consists of kind of 2 projects. One of them will be my Max Planck Independent Group Leader position, which for now is tentatively called Macroevolution of the Arts. And the second one is the ERC grant, more specifically about European literature and the evolution of that. And today I'll be talking about my research in general, and which also will give you an idea of what I'm planning to do in my research group over the next 5 years or so, kind of the direction where I'm planning to head. So what is evolution of literature and the arts? So I'm interested in studying some broad patterns or regularities in the cultural transmission of artistic techniques, and more specifically in 3 aspects of that. First of all, in success. Why are some artworks and techniques that are more popular than others, are more prevalent in the population of art makers and others? The secondly, transmission. How are artistic techniques transmitted between the generations of artists, writers, musicians, and so on? And thirdly, innovation. The question here is, how are new types of arts invented? What constitutes an innovation? What are the conditions that make innovations more likely to happen, etc.? So this is what I'm interested in. And if you want to read more about this, you can check out this chapter that I published recently in the Oxford Handbook of Cultural Evolution about the evolution of modern literature and film. And also I'm co-editing a collection on cultural evolution of the arts in the journal Evolutionary Human Sciences. So it also, the articles there give a pretty good idea of what it is, this direction of research. It's not live yet, like the articles are there, but the collection is not properly formalized yet, but it will appear soon. And I'll be talking today about 3 separate studies that represent each of those aspects of the evolution of literature and the arts: the success, the transmission, and innovation. Okay, success. So this is a study that I did with my 2 good collaborators, Mason Youngblood and Olivier Morin. we started with a question: why are some artists more successful, more popular than others? We all know the Beatles. They're extremely famous, but it is less known that there existed at the same time as the Beatles other very similar bands with similar music, similar haircuts, and even similar band names, like the Birds, the Turtles, and the Monkeys. And you can notice that all of them have typos in their names, exactly like the Beatles. And so, why do some artists become hyper popular, like the Beatles, and others not? Also successful, but not as successful as the Beatles. So, in other words, why do some become the Beatles and some remain the Turtles? There are many possible explanations, but generally speaking, there are two broad clusters of explanation which are kind of polar opposites of each other. The first one is this meritocratic view of success. According to it, those artists become the most successful who produce the most aesthetically pleasing works, or those who have worked the hardest. And this explanation was uh, championed in the book by Malcolm Gladwell, where he was saying that actually the reason why the Beatles are so successful is because they worked so hard. They worked for 10,000 hours they were playing in the small clubs of Hamburg, and that's how they built all the skills that have helped them reach extreme success. Another explanation, which is the opposite of meritocratic explanation, is that the extreme success comes from luck, and luck is the main factor in that. Luck, chance, drift, all the different the rich get richer effect, and so on. So that according to this view, there are no large aesthetic differences between ones like the Beatles and the ones like the Monkeys or the Turtles, and extreme success is determined by some random events. In this study, we suggested that there is a third explanation, that is that the innovativeness of artists also plays an important role in success. That successful artists are, we can think of them as artists inventors or artist innovators who are actually, they invent some new technique or some new way of doing something, and this is exactly what brings them uh, their fame. And actually, if we look at the same images of four bands, we can notice something interesting that, especially when we look at the time when they were founded, that the Beatles were founded earlier than the rest of those similar bands. So they were the founders of this style of music, and even more so, they were the founders of this whole new kind of music organization, which is called boy band. So Beatles are sometimes credited with being the first ever boy band, even though it's contested with a couple of others. So could it be that the order in which you enter a new trend in music or a new genre matters for your eventual success? So this is the main question of this study. And actually, in economics, there is a hypothesis that is very similar to our hunch. It's called the first mover advantage. And the idea here is that those companies or products that are the earliest to enter certain like new market niche, which is kind of empty, and they're the first to fill this in, they have some huge advantages over their competitors who come later to fill in that niche. And an example of this could be an iPhone, which was the first smartphone, and until this day, it remains one of the most popular smartphones on Earth, even though it's not much better than literally any other smartphones that is competing with iPhone. But because of this kind of a first mover advantage of Apple, it allowed them to build a loyal customer base, to be often one step ahead in certain technologies, um, uh, to basically to also to build a framework in the way which will be beneficial to them as well. So there are many things that the first mover advantage gives to the ones who come earlier to a certain newly opened domain. But how do we study the first mover advantage in the arts? And what is the kind of data that we can collect, really? And one of the problems with the study was that we didn't really have good data about the genres or genre labels. And it was quite hard to find those until we stumbled at the website called Every Noise at Once, which is an amazing resource which allows to which is like a huge collection of the smallest possible genre categories in music, and it was built as a side project of Spotify, which is very convenient because it's very easy to connect the data from collected from Every Noise and Once to the data from Spotify. And here's a glimpse at the page of Every Noise at Once. It's very fun to scroll through it. You can click on each of those labels and listen to the most representative tracks. But as you can see, it has those very detailed genres, not just something generic like techno or pop or rock, but something which those genre labels are very easy to find for literature, for films, for other kinds of arts. But this kind of detailed genres like dark progressive house or Polish techno or electronica peruana. This is something which is quite hard to come by, and this is why this website was very useful to us. And then we collected a lot of data from Spotify, namely 1 million songs. We organized it into two separate corpora. So one was a corpus of 100 random genres. So we took the 100 random genre labels from Every Noise at Once and collected all the songs on Spotify that belong to this 100 genres. But the problem is here data quality, because it can be pretty uneven, especially for the data which is before the year 2000, where the coverage of Spotify is not so good. And so we also collected a separate data set of 10 pre-registered genres, which we chose based on our knowledge. One of the co-authors is like a practicing DJ, so he knows very well electronic music. And we selected 10 of those, and we also checked every song in those 10 genres to assure that there are no random songs there, that all of them actually represent this genre, that the genre labels are of good quality. So, and how do one then find whether there is a first mover advantage for each of those genres? So the way we did this at first was this. So we simply looked at the relationship between the normalized play count of a song. So each dot here would be a song in our corpus. And play count is the total number of times that a song was listened to, normalized within a year. So basically compared to the songs published in that same year. And we looked at the relationship between that play count and the year of release of the song. And our prediction was that there should be a negative slope. There should be a negative relationship, so that the songs which are published earlier in, for example, this chill wave genre, they would be more popular on average than the songs published later in that genre. So they would have this diminishing returns, so to say, on becoming a member of this genre. But also, this data set, despite our attempts to make it very kind of to do different robustness checks, we're not sure that it doesn't have some weird historical aberrations, or there's a lot of interesting things that were also happening in music history during this time. For example, there was a transition from analog to digital, which also with the long period when the piracy was dominating music, the way people were listening to music. And as a result, there's a lot of interesting, weird fluctuations that we wanted to take care of. And as a result, we were not looking at the slope of this relationship as is, but we did something which I think a little bit more clever. Instead, we were comparing the slope of each target genre to a slope of books in the what we call the mixed genre sample. So we would collect the same number of songs with the same temporal distribution as in our target genre, such as chill wave, And then we would look at the relationship there. But the main difference, so that almost everything between these two samples would be the same, except the fact that the second sample, the songs there do not belong to the same genre. As you can see here, they have the dots of different color to signify that they belong to all sorts of things. And there we should not find the first mover advantage at all. And if we find there the first mover advantage, this negative relationship, it is a very bad sign. It means that there's something wrong with our study. And our results are actually support very strongly the first mover advantage hypothesis. So I'll explain how to read this plot. Basically, yeah, so here we have a plot for the 10 pre-registered genres like chillwave, drill, future bass, etc. And each blue dot shows the this effect of the year of release, which has to be negative, I remind you. Compared to the distribution of 100 or 1000 samples, random samples, which are meant to look as much as possible, as similar as possible to that genre. And the prediction was that basically the blue dot should always be more negative than the distribution of the sampled mixed genre songs. And in the case of our 10 genre sample, it is supported in 8 out of 10 times. And then for the, this is basically also what we find for the 100 random genres. You see that blue dots are almost always negative, and also even sometimes when they are not negative, they're still on the left side of the bootstrapped random mixed genre samples. So yes, that was the first study and the first question that we wanted to ask, whether there is a first mover advantage in music genres. And it is, the answer is here tentatively affirmative. Okay, the second study about the transmission.
Wait.
Yes.
Can we ask a question? Can you go back 1 second?
Yes.
So what's up with grime?
Oh, with grime. Actually, grime is a very interesting story because so grime was founded early in the 2000s. It started to become popular early in the 2000s, and it has an interesting history because it was like a countercultural music of black people in the suburbs of London. And it was also considered like bad music or music associated with crime. And that's why police was actively suppressing this genre and closing the concerts and so on. And the artists didn't have access to music making equipment. For example, they were making their tracks using gaming consoles because they didn't have access to other better computers. And there's a whole history of how they were making those music using PlayStation and Nintendo. And but then grime was actually rediscovered later, already in the early 2010s, and that's when it peaks in popularity. And that's when you look actually at the authors who are early in the grime from the 2010s, when they actually started to make contracts with the big production studios, big labels. You would find a first mover advantage there. But we were looking at the full history of them starting from the year 2000. That's why we don't see this effect here. At least that's our explanation why we do not find effect there. And so this is like one specific story of why it kind of didn't work. And we have like a bunch of other genres for which it doesn't work. And we didn't look into their stories with in so much detail. But probably there are other stories. Or it can be just bad quality data. Or maybe our theory is wrong. I don't know.
Nice. Thanks.
Can I ask another question?
Yes.
Is there any change in time of the effect? I mean, basically, roughly maybe 20, 30 years ago, there was a change in the way how music was transmitted and consumed. If we look before that, is the story the same, or is the characteristic time changing or something like this?
Actually, you'd be surprised, but this is such a good question, and we didn't really look we didn't look into this, and I never thought about this before. It's very easy to test this, of course, like just to look at the whether the slope, for example, becomes more negative over time, or the opposite, flattens out. But we didn't look into this, no, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So transmission. Several years ago, actually already quite many years ago, with Franco Moretti, we wrote a paper where we reviewed the state of the field of digital humanities. And we pointed out that if one looks at the computational history of literature, it usually is represented with one particular type of plot, which is a trend line. There's nothing wrong with trend lines, but the question that we started having after making this review, whether there's an alternative way of representing history, which may be capturing some details that are lost when we reduce everything to a trend line. And actually, there is. So here you can see, for example, a trend line of the frequency of dialogue in the novel in English literature. Actually, there is a way of representing history in a very different manner, and this type of historical modeling is a phylogeny, a phylogenetic tree or phylogenetic network, which is often used in evolutionary biology and in genetics, but also in this new field called cultural evolution. I mean, not so new, but still an underdog field, I would say. For example, phylogenies are the main tool at the Department of Linguistic and Cultural Evolution here in Leipzig, where you see here a tree from a paper about the Sino-Tibetan languages. And the linguists here, basically what they do, they collect basic vocabularies of 100 or 130, 50 core words that are not very likely to change over time, like hand or sun. Then they try to model the history of languages using those core vocabularies, but also different grammatical features of language and so on. And this allows them to, for example, answer the questions about the timings of splits of different language families. So which splits happened at which time, and also try to predict the origin of certain languages. Like there is a famous paper about the origin of Indo-European language family, and the phylogenists help to support one of the Anatolian hypothesis of the origin of Indo-European. Or, for example, other scholars of cultural evolution would try to use phylogenetic trees to model the history of folk tales. And there is a famous paper by Jamie Tehrani. He collected a data set of different versions of the Red Riding Hood folktale, and then he looked at the timings of splits of different types of that folktale, etc. So can we use something similar for the areas that I'm interested in, which is more modern, more recent literary and artistic history? Let's say the last 200 or 300 years. So Franco Moretti, in his book Graphs, Maps, Trees, suggested a hypothetical tree of literary evolution that it can be used for modeling the history of artistic devices, narrative techniques used or stylistic techniques used in books such as novels. So, for example, here you can see a tree of free indirect discourse, which is a particular type of representing character speech, which blends the speech of a character with the speech of a narrator, and it's not clear who is saying what, the narrator or the character. And it's famously presented in James Joyce, in Proust, in many other authors. And here you see the tree. So basically, it originated from Goethe and Jane Austen, was adopted by Flaubert, who popularized this technique. And then different authors kind of branching out in different directions were adopting this style of writing. But this tree is made on a very small sample, and the books were kind of handpicked, so it's not really built on from the bottom up from the data. And I would like to do something that actually is more robust and not just visualizes the idea, but actually, you construct the trees of literary evolution. But before that, we have to answer a different question, whether the tree is actually even a good model for representing literary history. Or maybe there is something else which is even better. This is a famous figure from the Anthropology book by Alfred Kroeber, who published it almost 100 years ago. And I really like the caption to this book, to this image, which says the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That is human culture, which is reads a little bit funny today. But the idea of Kroeber was that on the left, we have like a phylogenetic tree. So this is how biology evolves according to him. And on the right, we have the tree of culture. This is how culture evolves. And for him, the main difference was that in addition to the branching process, we also have in culture a lot of reticulations or horizontal transmissions. A lot of branches would connect again, because it's quite easy to, in the nature, the species which are far apart on the tree of life cannot really interbreed. They sometimes do, but rarely. But in culture, it's quite easy to take a book from one genre and a book from another genre and combine them into like a third thing. In fact, however, Kroeber was a bit mistaken, because the biological evolution doesn't look like a tree. It's a big simplification. For example, the evolution of microbes would look very much like this. And this on the right is called a rooted phylogenetic network, so that it has a root, meaning the beginning, but then we also have a network structure. So it's like a historical network. And it's quite hard to build those historical networks for things like languages, because people are usually dealing with like a historical slice of data. Usually they collect contemporary data on contemporary languages, and then they try to project the tree into the past. They don't have really the data on the past that much, or don't use this data. The same for folk tales. You have like a slice of time when the folklorists collected those folk tales in the 19th century, but you don't really know how it was, say, 1,000 years ago. And that's why they usually cannot construct rooted phylogenetic networks, because for that you also need to have information, more detailed information about when potentially those recombinations or reticulations would happen. And my hope is that it's possible to, or my plan actually, is to build rooted phylogenetic networks for literary data, because there you can actually do this because we have huge corpora of fairly recent data with precise dating of when each item was appearing, was released, was published. And this is the example of such a tree. This is a small example made on a subset of English literature for only 20 years, which we built with my colleagues as in a preparatory stage for building larger phylogenetic networks. And how to read again this visualization. So each color represents a genre of books, or a distinct community of books. And the height of each colored bar represents the number of books in that period or in that year. And if genres are connected with this thicker lines with each other, it means that there was noticeable influence between them. In this project, I'm quite early, so I don't really, here it will be the last network I will show you today, but I will tell you a little bit about the preparatory work that we were doing for this project. So one of the important things for building a network like this is to actually figure out the best way of doing unsupervised learning about book genres. It's relatively easy to do it in a supervised way. You train a model to recognize, say, science fiction, and you find all the instances of science fiction. But what we want to do here is to also find communities that we have no idea that they exist, like the genres for which we do not have the training set, and and which could also surprise us as researchers. And so basically, we have to learn to sort books by theme very well. You can imagine this process like this. We have a lot of books which are just like scattered around. We have to group them into distinct categories or distinct communities, and then hopefully these communities would correspond to some real genres that literary scholars were thinking about and writing about for a while. And to do this, we created a pipeline which we published in the paper Computational Thematics, comparing algorithms for clustering the genres of literary fiction, which I wrote together with Artem Sheля. And the idea of this pipeline was like this, that we take all the possible combinations of methods of clustering books by genre, and then we make a race between them, a competition, and we see which one wins. For example, we have selected different types of preparing the corpus, which we called different ways of doing thematic foregrounding, which is reducing the importance of stylistic elements of the text and highlighting the importance of topical or thematic elements of the text. You can choose different features of text starting from old school bags of words to something which is a bit more recent, like LDA, to something which is more recent, like vector embeddings. And we don't have here more. So this paper was published and started already maybe 3 years ago. It was published more recently, but it was a long process to do this before the LLM revolution. So we don't have more recent techniques here, but they can also be easily added to this pipeline. And actually, Andres Karius from your lab, he did something similar with our corpus. And then we can also compare different distance metrics between those features that we extract from text, like Euclidean, Manhattan, delta, cosine, etc. Because what was making me frustrated for quite some time is that people usually just randomly pick, for example, a kind of distance from all the possible distance metrics and then just use it, even though this distance can be just terrible and produce bad results. But we don't know, because we don't have some ground truth data. And for this study, we collected a corpus of 4 genres, exactly this: science fiction, romance, crime, and fantasy. And then we tasked each combination of methods, which amounted to like 291 combination, I think, to categorize those books by genre, and then we would compare the clusters created by the algorithm to the real clusters, so to say, which are present in our ground truth data, would give them a score of using adjusted rand index, which allows to compare clusters. And based on this, we would pick the winning combination. And we are planning to use this approach in the future by adding more methods to this pipeline as well. Yeah, so as I said, this is a work in progress. Maybe not so fun. It's more of a methodological heavy lifting, but we already have quite a lot of progress on this project, but I'm not ready to present it yet. So we have some networks, we've done some analysis on it, and we even found some interesting findings based on those clusters extracted. from the network, but I would like to do a bit more robustness checks before I present it to the world. All right, so that was the second study, and now the third about innovation, which is based on a very recent paper of mine called "Does Literature Evolve One Funeral at a Time?" So there is a famous quote by Max Planck, which so the more famous version is "Science advances one funeral at a time." But Max Planck never actually said this. He said something like that: "A new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die." And so my question was, does literary fiction evolve one funeral at a time? And I addressed this question with my co-author, Brad Beheim, who works here in Leipzig. We're not the first to ask this question, the question about the generational processes in the cultural change. So, for example, there is the paper by Ted Underwood, who is a digital humanist and professor of English literature, and Stephen Vasey, who is a sociologist and actually an expert in modeling cohort turnover in history, and their students Kevin Keeley and Venny Shang. And they found that, so they took a large corpus of fiction and they asked, what is a better prediction of a topic of a book? So here each dot would be a book published by each individual author, and colors represent two different topics of books. And they asked, what is a better predictor of a topic? The year of publication of a book or the year of birth of the author? And if that's the year of birth of the author, as we see here, you see that the authors who were born around the same time, they keep writing on similar topics throughout their lifetime. Then it would mean that cohort turnover or some generational change actually plays a big role in the change of topics in literature. And they found that it is a more important force, the cohort turnover, to the extent that like 60% of variation in their model is explained by the cohort change and 40% by all other possible factors. Olivier Morin, who is a cognitive scientist, had a somewhat similar study where he asked the question whether so he found that the younger painters are more likely to make stylistic innovations in paintings compared to older painters. And there's a bunch of other studies on the cohort turnover. It's like a small but interesting literature, which is also a little bit messy because I'm showing the papers that support the hypothesis of cohort turnover, but also there's a bunch of papers that reject this hypothesis. So what we did is doing kind of similar things, but with a very different method, with a very different technique. So we used a technique called decomposition analysis, which we borrowed from evolutionary ecology. And it boils down to this simple equation, which actually is based on a famous paper by George Price called Selection and Covariance. And that's how this mathematician is remembered until today by this equation, which is called the Price equation, which you see here. And our version is like a development of that equation by George Price. And George Price's equation is often considered this like a mathematical equation that explains evolution or that explains a lot of different things about biological evolution and how the variance and selection combined together in shaping the phenotypes or genotypes of individuals. I will not explain each term of the equation, but basically, so what's happening is that this equation decomposes the temporal change of some trait over time into three underlying forces: into the role of the entrance of individuals, their births, or the time when they write their first book, the exits of individuals, of authors, the times when they die or when they retire from writing, and the individual change of their preferences between, their entrance and between their exit, how they vary their topics between those two time points. And I will show you this on a plot. So this is the temporal trajectory of some topic, for example, and our equation basically decomposes each time step of this trend line into those three underlying forces, represented by the blue color, which is the role of entrance effect, red color, exit effect, and yellow color, individual change effect. And I'll also draw your attention to the fact that it can be both, those effects can be both positive and negative. So for example, here you see positive entrance effect, which means that the topic is growing as new authors are starting to write on this topic, or because new young writers are writing about this topic. But here, this topic is declining, and we see a negative entrance effect. And it means that new authors are not writing on this topic. And the same is true for each of those three effects, right? So for example, here we have the negative exit effect. It means that the topic is declining because some of the authors who used to write on this topic are retiring from writing. Or for example, here, this topic is still growing due to a slight positive exit effect, meaning that the topic is growing because the people who are exiting in this period were not at all writing on this topic. Okay, so this all may sound nice, but does it actually work? So to test whether it works or not, we used simple stochastic simulations where we simulated two very different scenarios. So in one case, we would have the scenario in which the change is driven by the cohort turnover. So here, each line is a lifeline of an author. Each dot would be a book that they produced, and the red dots would be books that have that specific topic that we're interested in. For example, the topic of science fiction, right? And here in this first scenario of the cohort-based turnover, all the authors who were having their formative years around this time, they keep writing about this topic throughout their career. But we also have a second scenario, which we call disruptive event simulations, where something happens, some big event, for example, a war or a COVID pandemic or anything. And then writers shift to writing on this topic. So they were not writing about it before, but they started to write about this because something happened. So can our method, this simple mathematical equation, distinguish between these two scenarios by decomposing the temporal trajectory of this pseudo topic? And actually it does, because in the first case, you see the predominance of blue and red color, meaning that those cohort effects, the effects of entrance and exit, blue and red. And here we have the predominance of yellow, which is the effect of individual change. Okay, so, and if we do the simulations many more times and we plot each simulated topic on the ternary plot, we would see the picture like this, where the disruptive event simulations would be neatly clustered around the corner of individual change. And the cohort-based simulations will be far from the corner of individual change, will be close to the corner of entrance effect, and still quite far from the corner of exit effect, which was a little bit puzzling to us. We didn't know why this is happening. Shouldn't it be here? Shouldn't those two things be symmetrical, the entrance and exit? And I will tell you about this in a minute, the answer to this question. Okay, so we're done with simulations. Now onto the real data. So we took a large corpus of books called HathiTrust Digital Library. We took 140,000. It has 140,000 books in English, but we created a sample, only fiction, reliable publication dates that are in this time range because, as you see on this Lexis plot, earlier in the time we have few books, not so many books. Here you have many books, but written by but there are few books per author, and we want to have the time frame where we have as many books as possible and also as many books per author, so that we have their careers as complete as possible. And we ended up having a data set of 23K works and 6,000 authors. We use topic modeling to transform those texts into features. We chose LDA because it's really convenient in the sense that it really allows to represent each book as a distribution of topics. So for example, I mean, probably you know this, but just in case somebody doesn't know, you have, for example, the book by Agatha Christie, Death on the Nile, the book by Jack London, White Fang. We have 200 topics for each book, but the topic of murder, detective, crime, kill, murder would be very well expressed, so to say, very well represented in the book by Agatha Christie and not at all expressed in the book by Jack London. And then we would look into we would do temporal decomposition of those topics, which hopefully represent pretty well what is in the books. Okay, this is a technical step that I will skip. And for example, we have a topic of war that, as you can see, if you look at the black line, it peaks around 1915, which maybe it's pretty obvious. Of course, there was a First World War, and this is probably why this topic peaked around this time. But having done the composition, we also know something additional about this. We see that this surge in popularity of the topic of writings about war is because of the positive individual change. So a lot of authors who were not writing about the war suddenly started to write about this, which suggests that there is some strong underlying event that was happening that was making them do this. But also, we can separate this type of historical dynamics from something like that. So here we have a different topics, a topic of frontier with top words as cabin, camp, trail, prairie, mile, log, blanket, etc., well represented by books like those by Jack London. And it also peaked around the same year as the topic of war. But the reasons why it peaked are very different, because here you see that this topic is driven by the cohort effects, the effect of entrance and exit of writers. What does it mean? It means that there was a group of people who were writing this type of literature, and this type of literature grew in prominence when they started their career, and it died with them. So, and because there was nobody else to write about this later, about this type of literature. And using our method, we can distinguish between topics which are more driven by cohort turnover and topics are more driven by individual change. And even more than that, we can separate, well, the periods which are mostly driven by cohort turnover and periods which are mostly driven by individual changes. So here you can see the first, there was the first peak which was driven by individual change. Okay. So here's the ternary plot of the simulated effects. Where do actual effects for the real topics lie on our plot? What is the big picture? What is the driving force of literary history? Does literature evolve one funeral at a time? This is where, so each dot would be an individual topic, and they cluster around here, meaning that we have the 43% of the role of individual change, and then around 60% together of the role of entrances and exits, which is very similar to how Ted Underwood and colleagues study what they found in their data. by using an entirely different method. But again, as we see, the role of entrances is twice as strong as the role of exits. Why? Should not they be symmetrical? And yeah, I like to say that literature does not really evolve one funeral at a time. It rather evolves, it would be more correct to say that it evolves one birth at a time, because the entrances are more important than exits. Why? We were puzzled with this for quite some time, but then we figured it out using simulations. So initially, when we were doing our simulations, we were simulating the careers of authors using a realistic distribution of career length, so that some people would have short careers, some people would have long careers. And that's what we have. But if we make this very unrealistic assumption that each author has exactly the same lifespan, we would have perfectly symmetrical entrance and exit effects. And this finding helps us explain, I think, why the entrance is more stronger. It's because every author comes through the early career stage in their writings, but not every author comes through the late career stage, because they can drop out in the middle for all sorts of reasons. And as a result, the collective push of young people is always stronger than the collective push of old people. And yeah, so that's why it would not be really, so literature does not evolve one funeral at a time. And we're planning to repeat this study on a lot of other data sets of music, of paintings, of scientific papers to see if this situation is similar in other domains of culture as well. This is it, and thank you for your attention.
Nice. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now I repeat this like every time people clap on Zoom. You can't hear it because Zoom filters it out, but this was awesome, and I think everybody agrees. There is one graphical clap in the audience, I see. So yeah, this is super inspiring. Can we, like, please, everybody online, just lift your hand. In the room, just do it too. If you want to ask questions, I can start if nobody lifts their hand. Why don't we just like continue with the very last example, right? So this is a rather interesting thing. Like we have the similar sort of like analysis where we look at sort of like artists when they produce their artwork and when they are collected in a museum. And one thing that is very striking there is like most works that are of public record are done between 25 and 35 years old. And then people sort of fade off. And then, you know, you have one other chance to get into the museum is when you die and people realize you're dead. And then they buy your works when you're 25 to 35 years old. Now, one of the weird things in this sort of circumstance is something which I try to sort of like put in all papers to avoid a shitstorm on social media in the discussion section, which is the fact that we're not talking about literary history or art history. We're talking about a particular data set. And in this particular case, if you have only, say, a couple of 10,000 works from HathiTrust, you probably got a couple of thousand authors, which are rather well known. That means they have sort of substantial careers. And so my question would be, is your result sort of distorted by the fact that, and let me use my most favorite factoid here, that Oxford University Press is way more awesome than awesome, way more frequent than awesome in the Google Books corpus, and probably people who have a substantial career and make it while young have actually way more substantial amounts of books in the Google Books corpus, and AKA that also means HathiTrust, right?
Yeah. Yes, you're right. Even though so first of all, I think there's a lot of, so we didn't really do some kind of a check on, and I don't know how to do like where should be the cutoff line when we look at the popularity of authors and what qualifies as popular and non-popular, but there's definitely a lot of niche stuff, and especially in HathiTrust before 1925, I think it's extremely well documented. Like the careers would be uh, very long in the sense that there's a lot of book present in the data set, and we also did robustness checks on whether it actually corresponds to the real entrance and exits and so on. And it does in the majority of cases. So like I personally I didn't see that there's was a huge bias towards the famous or canonical authors, and also we repeated the study on yes, on the canonical authors from French and Dutch corpora, and then also we did this study on several other things like the music data set of music lyrics, and we found the same position of the effect. So yeah, of course, the music data was much bigger than the corpus of literature. So it included a lot of smaller bands and so on. So I do not have the feeling that it is. There's always the bias, the preservation bias in the data, of course, but I don't know. How would you approach this problem?
Not sure. It's a good question. Like, actually, I think this is not a sort of diminishing of any result. The key thing is like, if this is like in the end explaining the selection and not actual history, then it explains the selection, which is also a really cool thing, right? Because obviously that is also part of history. So that is not something which I would, but the key thing is like if you got these like really different sort of simulations going on, the question is, what are we missing? I mean, obviously, these kind of canonic data sets, like even if you look at all of Spotify, that's like it's a minuscule amount of what's actually music in the world. It's like what's still sort of in, it has a beginning and an end, and people listen to it in sequence, like on a radio. And so that's a completely different ballgame than everything that is sort of like artificial sound and makes sense to people and is sort of awesome. So it's really hard to sort of like extrapolate to these like, really sort of foundational things that surmount to, our human body evolved to have culture like this and that, and it evolves like this and that. Because how do you actually differentiate the actual development of that? Like, how do you differentiate the development of culture from the story how culture is told? Right. So that is sort of like a really interesting thing, I think.
Yeah, actually, I've been thinking about this a lot. So one of the projects which we started quite some time ago, but hopefully we will finish it sometime next year, is trying to model the process of actually corpus formation. How people assemble a corpus. And what biases appear in the data because of that process of corpus formation. And I think there are some distinct biases that sometimes appear and sometimes are reported in journals like Nature and Science as findings. Like, all scientific papers become decline in quality over time, or like decline in disruptiveness over time, or that all music becomes worse over time, or like and so on. But then usually those trends are being found because of the recency bias in the corpus. That's and the canonicity bias, so to say, that the better stuff is better preserved, and as a result, you have the illusion that the past was better than the present. Yeah. So yeah, it is an open question. I actually I tend to think that smaller but more carefully curated data is better than bigger data where you don't really know what's happening. And I'm kind of trying to find a balance in my studies between those two. Yeah.
Yeah, I fully agree. Thank you very much with that. Like, so there's this, nothing. It's always good to have the archaeological experience of one excavation where you had every potsherd in your mouth and you can feel with your tongue what the shape actually is, and do this repeatedly over time, so you actually you learn also how your tongue works, right? And so I'm picking that example because that is actually what archaeologists sometimes do, and this makes it to no database. because then they obviously come up with other measurement methods which sort of like tell them like how that works. But I think this is a really, really important thing because you get a lot of surprises if you look at tiny data in 15,000 ways over time, doing it over and over again. So you can actually see what's the difference. While if you do this macroscopic view, and I'm just as guilty as sort of like all of you are, when Jane Austen becomes a data point and Jack London becomes a data point, then this is sort of like that is not the same thing as like 15 people reading the book and thinking something completely different, right?
Yeah.
Yuri has a question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. It was of special pleasure for me also because it was a talk from my compatriot. I'm also from Ukraine. So, Vitayo I have actually two questions. One about the second part of your talk and the second one about the last part. Concerning the second part, many of references you were giving and in general this applying complex network science to study texts. It was frequently used by my late colleague Ralph Kenna from Coventry University. And especially they were doing this to study mythology. Even by his colleagues, he was aptly named father of mathematics. So using mathematics in mythology. Some of people you were citing, they were frequent also in Coventry, and there were regular workshops which were named MMM, Mathematics Meets Mythology. Also, the book appeared, I think Tehrani was in this book and some other people. And my question is, are you aware about these activities, about these workshops and about this book or not?
Mathematics meets mythology.
Yeah, Coventry workshops.
Unfortunately, no, I don't know.
I will send you the reference. That's my dear and late colleague, and he passed away 2 years ago. And when he was active, he had nice papers on that.
Please do.
The second question, thank you. The second question is about the last part. You started from Max Planck about this. You cannot convince all people they should die. That's something I experience also, in physics, for example. I am by training a physicist, but I'm not aware that this statement was checked, at least in science. Now you are checking this in literature, and you end up by statement basically that there are less old people in literature because they keep the field. And I think also in sciences, I see much more postdocs and PhD students as professors. So having this reason that less people survive being aged and working in the field, why should not we expect to have the same outcome in science, not only in literature? What would you say on this?
Yeah, I expect it to be similar. We didn't study the scientific data using our method yet, even though it's relatively easy. But there is several papers that do look into this so-called Planck principle in scientific papers, but they find very different results. Like some of them say that it is the case, and some of them say that it's not the case. And I think that the reason why their results differ is because they really kind of operationalize this phenomenon in very different way. For example, in one paper, they really look at what happens when you have like a premature death of a leader of a scientific school, like of a big lab. What happens to their postdocs, to their students? And they found that, like all sorts of terrible things happen to those people, unfortunately, because their careers usually go down if you have this situation. And so they said, yes, we have the Planck principle shows for the scientific paper. But there is another study which I really like. It was from 1980s. It looks at the adoption of one particular theory, the tectonic plate theory in geology, and it shows that actually the older people were much quicker to adopt this new theory than the younger people. The reason why I really like the reasoning is it says that it's probably because older people in academia are more secure in their position, and so they are more open to actually adopt new stuff. That no bad things will happen to them because they have already a tenure and stuff like this. And so that's inconclusive because people really take very different ways of measure this phenomenon, and it's not really clear when whether they're measuring the exact same thing. But it is our plan to just take a lot of data from on a bunch of sub-disciplines and see what is happening using our method.
Yeah, very interesting. And just related questions, since we are talking about the last part of your talk, when you say top words, I understand you use some machine to define the most frequent words the most relevant and frequent words. But how do you define topics? How did you define that this book is about the war? So the top word may be war, but it may be not the war between people, a kind of some in metaphoric sense and so on. It is some expert evaluation of the topics of the given book?
No, that's why I was giving the top words. So I just say that it's a topic of war kind of for convenience. But I mean, if you look at it's much longer than the top 10 words. It's pretty clear from the first, I don't know, 50 words that all of them are related to army, to war, to battle, to weapons, and so on. But it was not expert evaluations. But this is how it's typically done with LDA, that usually people just give the top number of words and call it a day. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, welcome.
Mikhail.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you. It was fascinating.
Thank you.
Personally, I had a great pleasure. Second, I have a couple of questions. One is basically concerning this very thing, this thing which is now on the screen, and the last part of your talk. Honestly, I didn't understand your argument why people living at different ages leads to entering be more important than exiting.
Okay.
Because I mean, obviously, if the system is stationary, then nevertheless the number of entrances is equal to the number of exits, and therefore my sort of question or argument is basically might it be somehow related to the fact that probably the corpus is growing the intensity is growing in time, or is it not?
No, it's not. It is really so it's because so think of it, yeah, you have the same number of entrances as you're saying the number of exits, but they're concentrated differently. Like the exits are kind of more evenly as like butter on a bread kind of spread, while the entrances are like a chunk of chunk of butter, so to say. Like
Yeah, so basically you're saying that if we assume that there is some sort of the most fashionable topic at each point of time, then all the entrances are on this topic and the exits are sort of evenly distributed over all topics.
Well, yeah, the thing is that for us, what matters is those moments when the growth of when you have a significant change in the trend, either positive or negative, whether it corresponds with a certain large magnitude of a certain effect, either positive or negative. And this is not, and what we found that this is not happening for exits.
Yeah.
Yeah, you see? Yeah.
Well, at least, yeah, large slopes should be associated with, cannot be associated with exits, yes.
Yeah, and it's not, and the question is why? And the reason is why, because people are not exiting at the same time.
Yeah.
People who write on the same
that is clear. That is well, the fact that people have different career lengths is indeed, and as Yuri mentioned, in science as well. Also in science, at least up to some point, probably not anymore, but up to at least 90s, 1990s, there was sort of exponential growth of the number of scientists. So at any moment in time, there were much more younger scientists than elder ones, and much more entrances than exits.
Yeah, this is something actually that in general we didn't take this into account. It would be important to somehow model the population growth into this thing so that we could, yeah, could find the signatures of that if present. But yeah, we didn't do this. Yeah, it's like a simple first thing that we did, and we're planning to expand and build a little bit on top of this on this method, and then also release it as an R package later, etc. So it's a better thing to done.
Yeah, and the second question is sort of series of questions related to your first part, to the first advantage of innovators' advantage, so to speak. Number one, just sort of qualitative argument / comment. Isn't it actually repackaging the merit argument in some sense? Because you can argue that the person who innovates is sort of the person who does something essential in the field, and that in this sense deserves the reward.
You are right. It is a repackaging, but it is a repackaging that I like much more. I think it's more closer to the truth because, for example, if you think about, say, a genre of historical novel, like the most famous historical novelist of all times is Walter Scott. But if you read modern historical novelists, it's so much better than Walter Scott, right? And yet, but and the same I would say is
true. Yeah, but basically, sorry to interrupt, but basically my point is that after Walter Scott, another one which everybody knows is War and Peace, and it is exactly because it is more innovative than it essentially starts a subgenre of its own.
Well, yes, and okay, to return to your question. It is a repackaging of the meritocracy argument, but it's not based on the aesthetic quality of a work, but more on the qualities of an or likely qualities of an individual, or that made those innovations. And in general, I very much like to convince more people to shift towards the view that. This book is great because it's good, towards like this book is great because it's innovative, or I think it's more adequate description of artistic or cultural.
Yeah, makes perfect sense to me. And then the second question, more or less concerning this thing, do you know of any sort of theoretical modeling works which model this phenomena, or basically studying, for example, what parameters may influence the intensity of the effect, etc.?
Yeah, there is one modeling paper from I think Peter Sheridan Dodds, that's his name, from the network science realm, and he has a nice paper. They even have like a nice website where you can play with different parameters of the first mover advantage and kind of see how it's to make it happen faster or slower, and decrease or decrease the magnitude of it. So, but I know only that one modeling paper. Yeah, because there's much more work on the first mover advantage in. So there's some, I would say, smaller in network science, and there's much bigger in some not very good management science, where it's usually not great research, and so yeah. So I wish there was a better mathematical kind of foundation to this.
Isn't there's like, I think Mark Newman papers about this in first mover advantage in science.
There's a Newman paper as well. Yeah.
Not unrelated to the Peter Dodd's work, which is in a stream where there is also a paper, I think, with Duncan Watts about like, if you flip a chart, does the good music make it back up to place one? And it turns out it doesn't. So it makes it back up, but not quite to the top. And so there is this. They also sort of like maybe separately work about this trinity of like intrinsic fitness of objects versus the social sort of like a temporal order, like preferential attachment in a sense is that too, right? This is also a first move advantage. Like you become a hub in a network if you're sort of an early node in the preferential attachment process in a sense.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's
probably
sorry.
Yeah, there's probably a lot of work that can be repurposed from network science to this problem, basically.
Exactly. I mean, in this, I was really very much inspired by the network science, and I cite many in the paper, like also in the book "The Science of Science" by Dashun Wang and Laszlo Barabashi. It is like this phenomenon is mentioned there, but I think they only cite there the Newman paper, and because like there's I don't know, I think there's because nothing more there, even though it would be interesting to do more studies in this direction, I think, but yeah.
There is this related work by, also Laszlo Barabasi, and there's like Roberto Sinatra on it and so on, which is about sort of like the nickname of the paper is basically quality, productivity, and unknown pleasures. So basically you have like what does predict how successful you are as a scientist? And obviously it makes a lot of sense to work a lot. But then when your great breakthrough has to do with your excellence, but really when it happens is sort of random. That's the unknown pleasure part. And so that is sort of something which is quite interesting here, because if you look at your plots, you sort of take an inverted perspective, right? There is a sort of, you look at a genre and you don't have the onset time. So you don't know when that actually breaks. It's like, whenever Yellow Magic Orchestra sort of adopts whatever comes out of Cork to produce something that now is danceable electronic music and not, semi-danceable Kraftwerk anymore. Like when that happened was sort of pretty unpredictable. But the way you look at stuff is actually you say, okay, here's this genre. And then at the onset, lots of people move in. And then there is a long fade off, because most of these plots, except for the bottom one here, have a sort of like right skewed tail. And that is really interesting in terms of functions, because there is sort of like also other areas, not just like plain network science, that look at these kind of things, particularly if you look at time series analysis, the problem of shocks, for example, like entrance very much looks like an exogenous shock. So there is something, maybe an opportunity, that you can do music with autotune, for example. And then sort of like that's how people move in. So it's not like they come unprepared by birth, but they move in because there is some sort of exogenous advantage. But then the fade off looks a lot like endogenous. Like people die because they have cancer, not because they decide to not do music anymore. And I think that is a sort of really interesting thing, because it actually points to the other real big problem was like, what does it change actually? Like we talked a lot about entrance and exit. It's a little bit like, birth, death processes that people look at the power grid, or like we did with the birth, death paper, for example, with the, network framework of cultural history. But the key thing is like, what is this underlying change in the middle, which seems to be sort of a slower, much more heterogeneous process. And my question would be, have you tried to model that? Because like I remember we worked about ranked systems in general. Sort of like the take home was, yeah, you can model the noise of like how that influences, like destabilizes or stabilizes the whole system, at least partially. But the fitness term of like what's actually going on in the individual ranked object, or in this case, the individual author or individual artist, good luck with that, because it can be all sorts of things. But it seems like because you actually have some trajectory, you probably can make some sort of like deduction about this last term in your equation, in a sense. Or am I wrong about this?
I'm not sure that I understood everything in your question, but about the modeling the process kind of in between. So the thing is that because I guess I come from a different perspective. So in cultural evolution, usually that's exactly what's being modeled, like the process
Mhm.
of transmission of ideas and all kinds of forces that influence that. But what's not usually modeled is the birth birth and death, like this demographic factors that are usually not included in the process. It's kind of assumed that you um, that there's nothing particularly important happening at the beginning or at the exit of an individual, while I think in reality there is a lot of important things happening. Um, so yeah, I'm not sure if that is anyhow contributing to your question, but also I didn't fully understand your question. So
So if we think about these your equation, right?
Mhm.
Think about it as like three different functions that sort of like make up the equation, and then like you can ask yourself, what's the first equation as a function? What's the second one? And so what's the birth process? And it's obviously not people being born, but it's people sort of like putting their attention to, in this case, a genre. And then the exit is sort of like moving out for whatever reason. And then you made, basically calling it birth and death is already a decision to sort of like,
Of course, yeah.
right? Um, but it's interesting that you say that like usually you're actually looking at this change issue, like, selection over time, and obviously you have the words and stuff like that. So you can actually do that. So that is sort of like, I think, a really interesting thing that you can tackle this third part of your equation and actually look at sort of the underlying content. And that is sort of something which you sort of like with your downward slope, you have a sort of like interesting hypothesis, I think, that you say, okay, the genre becomes stale over time. But that is also something which think about the whole artificiality of genre. Like genre is like, maybe for the top ones, like, romance, criminal story, war story, whatever you can, or science fiction, you can have such a model. But like for the big tail, the heavy tail of your, what was the thing? Every noise at once.
Hmm.
I mean, that's just like random concept some dude comes up with in a record store and puts three records in the same box, right? And so,
Not really. No, no. It's better because it's that's why it was actually very hard to find those genre labels so that it would
okay.
not be that. So actually, those labels in every noise at once. These are so what they did is there was this engineer at Spotify who basically did just community detection using acoustic features of songs and on top of that, well, their lyrics, and on top of that, the co-listening behavior, as is typically done in this algorithmic suggesting algorithms, right? So he combined
Mhm.
all of these things and ended up with those clusters, which are surprisingly good. And then, yes, the labels were he or the machine called it Polish disco or something like this. So of course the genre name here is artificial, but it's not important. It's important that the community which is being named is pretty much real and it was there were some processes that shaped this community. But what I was looking at actually, so the genres are not the best thing for me. I think a best thing would be actually because genre is just a proxy for an invention of a new tool, right?
Mhm.
I think a genre usually people call it a genre when there is some new distinctive thing being invented, but it will be much better to actually measure those new tools. And in some data set, you can do that. For example, there is this nice data set of board game mechanics. And you can see how new board game mechanics are being introduced in which specific games. And interestingly, you do have there also first mover advantage pretty strongly. That games that introduce new mechanics are become the super successful games in the end. And there's also like a downward slope. Yeah. So
But
genre here is like a very imprecise proxy, but we like worked really hard trying to find it as good as possible genre label. But it's
yeah,
yeah.
so thank you. First, I think Polish disco is still a random dude or an algorithm putting three records in a box. So that is sort of something which I think would be really interesting to unpack. But here's another one. If you take your example of board game mechanics,
Mm-hmm.
that is a very, like, the whole game design field is dominated by, finite state machines, by mechanics that you can actually write down as an algorithm. But, just like watch a bunch of teenagers playing Dungeons and Dragons while being drunk and in costume, you will have a really hard time writing down what's actually going on. And they may still actually sort of like have a sort of self-similarity of what's interesting. And there may still be some kind of like thing that happens 20 years down the road, but nobody remembers what exactly happened. So the question is, are we captured by this issue that we're discretizing certain things? We're discretizing something in the concept of genre and in the things that we like to sort of hold on, words, genes, game mechanics, whatever. Like, it's really comfortable for us to write it down that way. It's like, again, this is not a critique. It's a question I carry around with myself for a really long time. Because if you study sculpture and painting, it's constantly in front of your face because there is no enumerable whatever, right? And so the question is sort of like, actually, what does it do? And often genre is sort of something which is much more a property of the historiography than it actually is a property of the stuff we're actually talking about. And so in some sense, can we question all of these discrete things while still doing what we're doing? That I think is a sort of like really big challenge for the next couple of years in a sense.
I agree with you here that it is really hard to discretize, and that these are very important decisions on which your basically result of the study can completely depend on basic what units you're looking at. Um, but uh, but I also I don't think that because it's exactly in this example it's not. So one way of dealing with this, because so actually, okay, I'm rambling a little bit, but mm, I also wouldn't want to do a study like this by,
Mm-hmm.
for example, genre tags which are given by the libraries. That's one type of data which is always there. Or I wouldn't like to do this study using tags given on like Goodreads or another website like this, some kind of a crowdsourced way of attributing genre tags. So I think they are essentially flawed and they do not notice some important properties, partly because they are always retrospective in some way, or because maybe they're not enough retrospective because they're given in the moment of time, some of them. So there are all kinds of biases there. But if we're working with the algorithmically detected communities in a network,
Mm-hmm.
and if you find meaningful clusters there, and then you can work with those clusters, you can say that, okay, this is actually something real because this is not like a human decision. It is
Okay, that's an interesting one. So let me just relativize that because I'm pretty sure uh, people on your side and people of what I'm going to say in a second will meet in peer review chambers and kill each other. So what human curators do, like human database curators, from Flybase to people, attaching subject headings in the Library of Congress or an archaeology library, is different from what a computer can do. And I'm not talking large language model. I'm just talking LDA. Like if you sort of like filter topics a la LDA out of texts, you get a completely different result from human curators because the human curators, they're like sort of like the human part of the Eco pair, Umberto Eco. Text is like a machine, like a lazy machine with gaps that needs to be filled in by the reader. So human curators can actually attach subject headings that are not in the book, but sort of like give a meaningful position to the book. Like, for example, it may say Palestrina, and then you say, something like, sort of like sanctuaries on hills. I mean, this is not mentioned in the book, but the sort of like archaeologists may know that this is the most important thing that archaeologists will search for. And of course, you're right that there is a bias in the individual curator, in the institution doing this kind of classification. But so is it in your algorithm, because nobody can do the matrix of everything compared with everything else. And therefore, all of these things is sort of like weirdly sparsified. So in some sense, I think we should not kill each other's research by sort of saying, you have a bias or you have a bias, you don't look at that and you don't look at that, but actually focus on these kind of biases, because they may actually be the valuable part, which is what people always forget, because like if you got everything and there is no bias, you got just white noise. And that's probably boring, right? So that is sort of, I think, a really, really, really important thing, that these genres of labor that either cost a lot of computation or cost a lot of human lifetime, like 50 archaeologists doing a library classification for 50 years, they both are human achievements which we have to take seriously, particularly because they really influence, and here's this word which I've really very, very rarely used, there's an influence of that labor on the people who, for example, use the library. That is a really, really important point.
I agree, and I'm not the one who's saying that like human classification or human coding is not important. Not at all. But I'm saying that some labels are usually done by human coders are usually better than others because, for example, usually human coders would be pretty well. There's a very important labels like the birth and death years of a writer, the very broad genre, like this is a novel, like some certain things that don't really change that much over time. But it's really hard to give good labels, for example, in terms of like a library catalog for things that are changing all the time. And you have to, and very often library catalogs are quite conservative in attributing new labels. So you would find like things being misclassified because this is already a very new thing, but it's still classified with old genre tags because yeah, it's there's this lag, and and I think it's this kind of a metadata on culture, which is collected as the culture is evolving, often is partly a document of that history as well, and not an objective, not as good as taking this full chunk of history, say 100, 200 years, and evaluating it from a single systematic perspective, I would say. Yeah. But
Yes.
I agree with you broadly that this is a very there's a lot of problems there and a lot of unanswered questions, and I wish they were pronounced more often, because very often it's happening that you just take a data, it's good that it's big, you just quickly run something, and then some fancy new algorithm, and then you hope that you find something unusual, and then you report this something unusual in a confident way, and that makes a paper. But so I agree that we should treat data very, very carefully here.
I think, yeah, thank you very much. I think this is also like a call to like the editors and so on, that like they don't ask us to put the bias analysis into the supporting material, but actually it should be in the main bulk of the paper, because that's the interesting part. There is nothing wrong with finding bias in data, because, think about biology. It's the difference between life and death of a whole lot of patients, for example. Andres Karius has not asked a question, but has his hand up, and then Mikhail Tom. Is that okay?
No, I'm done. I'm done.
Okay, good. But your hand is still up. Okay, Andres, go ahead.
Yeah. So hi, nice to see you. So I had a question about like one of the earlier things you mentioned. So the literature study, which as you pointed out, I also replicated to some extent, sort of clustering stuff. I was just curious if you guys have in the meanwhile like tried any of this stuff that we discussed back then, like the sort of large language model zero-shot kind of classification, because I mean, at least based on my limited replication, it seemed to work pretty well. Like you can basically classify things into any genres or any kind of genre systems or taxonomies you want?
Yeah, we did. We didn't. Short answer is no. We didn't. We didn't do that. The longer answer is that it. I will definitely. I definitely want to do that in when I will start my group. So because now we're in the process of kind of shaping those networks using still the older techniques, and there's a lot of problems in the pipeline of building the networks themselves that we're currently trying to figure out. I mean, we've mostly solved them. And then we will publish like a pilot study with the network and using this older tools that we had, like Doc2Vec embeddings. But then I want to do a bigger and better version of this study where we would for example, use a lot of different other types of features, or maybe even actually replacing some of those parts of the pipeline with like a zero-shot methods. But so actually, I have an idea that you probably might like, because now we're currently building this complicating pipeline of, so we have a model so we have a way of determining the thematic proximity between texts. That's one thing. And then additionally, we are having a mathematical model, which I was not talking about, which takes that as one of the parameters, the thematic similarity, but another parameter would be the attention decay, like how popular is a book during a given moment of time. So, and the popularity would be kind of slowly decaying of books, and their potential for influencing other books will also be decaying over time. So we have all of this complicated, relatively complicated machinery. But then I thought to determine the influence between the books. But then I thought, what if I just ask an LLM what is the influence of that book on the other book, you know, and or
So
that,
like text reuse or something.
exactly, yeah, kind of rated on the scale between 0 and 1, the the influence of that book on the other book, and
Yeah, kind of. I mean, if you can fit both books in the context window, then that might actually work.
yeah, and because I tried doing this on a very small kind of anecdotal examples, and it seemed to work surprisingly well. It's like shockingly good. And then so I want to find a way to have ground truth for that somehow, but it's really hard to find that ground truth for influences between authors. But somehow finding that, and then testing LLM for predicting the influence between books, and then maybe using that in the network. So that could be an interesting way of doing that.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't use it just like just ask it like as a question because that probably hallucinates a lot. But if you can fit the data into the context window, then yeah, that
Yeah.
might actually work. Yeah. Also, I haven't said that yet, but congratulations on the new position. Also, that sounds pretty awesome.
Thank you, Andres. Yeah, yeah, it's great. I'm really looking forward to that. That will be some exciting things ahead. Yeah, thank you.
So that's probably something the whole audience is most interested in the wider, like, people watching this on YouTube, as you are starting sort of like two sort of groups at the Max-Planck-Institute for Empirical Aesthetics. And you talked most of the time about stuff you have already done or that is sort of like in the pipeline of being done probably before this starts. I think people may be interested in, like, what's the architecture? How do you see your research program rolling out in the next 5 years or so? In particular, what do you think in terms of like how will ERC, starting grant, high risk, high gain, differ from Max Planck independent group? And how do you think, for example, does this change the profile of Max Planck Institutes in this cultural humanities area as a whole, and how in particular this Max-Planck Institute for Empirical Aesthetics is sort of a thing which should be more widely known, basically. That'd be really cool if you could talk a little bit about like the next 5 years gonna be awesome. Cultural analytics will happen no matter what you guys do.
Yeah, so I will start from the ending. So the MPI in Frankfurt is actually mostly doing cognitive and neuroscience of art perception and mainly music perception. And now there's a new director who's interested also in genetics, like neuroscience and genetics, and they're doing that. Like for example, the is perfect pitch is it somehow genetically determined and so on, things like that. But so and my group will be actually and that's how it was from the very beginning of this institute. And my group, I think, will be one of the first that will be just, or maybe the first one that will be focused on historical dynamics of the arts, kind of trying to study history of the arts from the empirical perspective. There were some other groups, but for them it was not the main focus. It was just like a side project here and there. But I think my group will be the first one that will be studying history from this perspective. And I'm planning to make my group into a place where these two worlds, the world of cultural evolution, which I know and I'm connected to on the one hand, and then the world of computational humanities, digital humanities, that I also very much like, and I'm also connected to make them meet for some sort of symbiosis. This is what I was trying to do already for many years in my papers, in all kinds of workshops. There was organized conferences. Andres remembers the Cultural Evolution seminar, which was in Tartu University, that we were running with Peter and with Artyom for a long time. So I don't know, this continuous effort to make these two fields closer to each other, because for example, cultural evolution is great. It has a lot of theory. It has a lot of cool math, but it has very little interest in the arts and the humanities. I mean, it has interest, but it just originated in the disciplines that do not typically engage with the artistic subjects. And then in computational humanities, you would have a lot of interesting methods, and in the humanities, you would have a lot of cool expertise that people have on each specific thing, but usually you would not have people tackling these nomothetic questions, as the somewhat technical term for those questions about general principles or patterns or processes, which are often asked, for example, in the network science, but also in the cultural evolution. And I want them to meet. So there's several things that will be happening. Like mainly there will be in the framework of ERC, there will be this project of creating or the systematizing all the literary data that we have for European literary history for the last 200 years, both metadata and the corpora, and assembling them into some nice usable data sets which are easy for studying literary history across time, but also across space. So they would have, data for different national literatures, because currently you would have not that many for example, comparative studies of European literature. It's usually would be usually each national literature would be focused, scholars of each nation would be focused on their specific language or literature without making comparisons. Or if they make comparisons, those comparisons would not be historical. And the goal of that ERC group will be actually to study European literary history in time, but also across cultures. But I have also, so that will be the main focus of the ERC, and that's how I wrote it in. That's what the reviewers voted for, and I will have to do that. But for Max Planck Research Group, it's much more flexible. Basically, they just tell me do whatever you want, and whatever I want will be. I'm planning to continue a lot of this fun side projects on music, on different data sets, the different kinds of arts. But one of the bigger ideas is to work on film and to work with actually the images of film themselves, not the metadata, and then try to address a lot of interesting questions. And also, there's the about the history of movies and how styles change in film, but also I'm trying to. I'm planning to engage with the experimentalists in that institute, so they would do some experimental studies of perceptions. They have this very fun theater there where you can measure a lot of kind of biological data from people, the heart rate, the EEG, and a bunch of other things when people are, for example, watching a movie. And I'm planning to do a lot of stuff with that, but it's still a little vague, so I'm not really gonna talk about a specific project. It's just the direction into which I'm planning to go. Yeah.
And then associated question, which probably all the master PhD and postdocs, potential postdocs may ask is like, you're probably hiring now, right? Because you're building two
Yes.
groups.
Yeah, I should have mentioned this. Yes, I'll be hiring quite a lot of people. So not immediately, not at once, slowly, but I'll be hiring PhD and postdocs. So if some PhDs or postdocs are listening to us, or later I would contact you when there will be a call so that you distribute it with the PhDs and postdocs in your group and in your circle, because yes, there will be hirings.
Cool. There is no hands up anymore, but we can go on. One interesting thing is like one question I had throughout the talk is like, you are not a user of standard plots all the time, but you construct plots, which is great. There is not that many people doing that. So my question is like, like what's your inspiration? Like, it's not straightforward to use a Lexis map. It's not straightforward to have this like little map with the bumps that you have this, what was it, relation of release date and play and play count, where you had this little bumps. So that was like a thing, like having constructed both of these kind of plots myself and encountered weird peer reviewers who thought that was strange. I have this question, like, do you have a strategy? Like, how do you come up with stuff like this? Is this the way you think, and or do you think in equations, or do you think in algorithms? So tell us a little bit more about this, because I think that's a sort of like also therapeutic story for people who think like that, and they have a hard time sort of like communicating it.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, nobody asked me this before. I do much think in visually, so I very much think in terms of images and plots and drawings, and I'm trying to visualize ideas in the best way possible. And I also I'm trying in my papers to do this more and more, so that the main ideas would be visualized, like not described, but in text, but also visualized in some very obvious image. For example, with that plot for the first mover advantage paper, I guess you were talking about the one where we compared.
Yes, exactly that one. Yes.
Yeah, so that actually we were okay, there we were forced to do this. Like that's how I was always thinking about it in terms of this plot, like that's how the process looks like. But then we couldn't get accepted to journals because the reviewers didn't understand what we actually did. And I thought, okay, this is such an obvious pipeline. Why don't they understand? Because it was obvious from the reviews that they're asking questions as if they do not know what's happening. I thought this is so strange. So maybe this is not obvious, That's
Yeah.
not obvious. And then me and Mason, we came up with this illustration, and I think yeah, so it worked pretty well. And but I think also I often work with people who also have already the some kind of a tendency to think in images, maybe because it's easier for me to meet them and talk with them, and because it's easier to find common language. And like the Lexus plot was suggested by Brett, my collaborator, and yeah, so it is, but I do find this very useful. Yeah, the unusual visualizations, because I think also it's good for papers. It just attracts attention, and it's
Yeah, I think this is sort of something which is really important because biology is full of people like that. There's even, Broad Institute hired designers in order to construct figures, not to make them pretty, but to actually sort of learn something they didn't know before. And there is quite a subculture. Like Peter Dodds and I, we have like conversations about that going on since, for years, where they came up with a thing they call it the allotaxonograph, which is another plot which sort of like is in my network framework paper. There's a birth-death plot that is exactly that, which looks like the size of war, but it goes down to all the way to 1. And so this is a plot that we encounter in a lot of systems. There's a LexisNap like this. In this particular case, the reviewer told me this is a LexisNap. I just thought that was like a logical thing to do. And so I think that is sort of like important thing, which over years, this is sort of something we should sort of like also surface. What are these means of communication, which are not the first 5 plot types that you learn when you do a Python class or whatever, right? Because when people learn that by sort of just adjusting their plots, they can actually learn something that is really, really cool. So thank you for that. And there's one.
Actually, I would very quickly, I would say that I think you're onto something here. I didn't think of it immediately, but I'm really surrounded by people who in this institute who have training in biology.
Yeah.
And I also am learning so much from them because some of the papers are like artworks. It's shocking how good they are. They make this amazing like 3D cut-offs of a forest with like birds flying all over it just to illustrate, and then mapping towards the data that they collected in that part of the forest that match just perfectly onto the actual map. And it just looks so beautiful. And it's like, oh my God, this is like, how can I be a little bit more closer to that? For example, also they have this long history of making all kind of small cute visualizations of animals and making those plots with the little icons and all big libraries of those icons and everything. That is just I don't know why it developed in biology so much. I think maybe because there's also a long history of, for example, paleo art, and very often biologists would also, those who work with animals, they also would be trained to make drawings, and there's a lot of unusual types of visualizations, like in this old books on evolution. They're filled with cool, unusual plots so it is definitely a source of inspiration that I didn't think about before, but it's definitely true.
Yeah, I think there's like Leibniz was called a drawing thinker, and this is sort of like something which there's a whole literature actually on this. I would like to give a word last question to Scott Gresham Lancaster because he's a rare visitor, and then we have to wrap up. Scott.
Well, yeah, I typed this in the chat. Can you hear me?
Yes.
How are the ubiquitous presence of LLMs and related technology influencing the trajectory of your group's research? And I'll take my answer on the air.
Sorry, how is could you repeat it, please?
Yeah. So how does LLM, like sort of large language model, how do they influence sort of like the trajectories of your research group? That's an excellent question which you could ask all of us, but that's sort of like ubiquitous in science right now. I'm really also curious to hear your answer, Oleg.
Yeah, so there's several things that I think it's very good for working with for trying to make messy data less messy. That's one of the things that I already started doing this for coding variables, something that in the past research assistants would do. Now you can safely give this task to an LLM actually, and it would do a very good job. So it's also something that is happening. One of the ideas that I'm having for something I wrote into ERC proposal that using it a bit more creatively as the artificial writers that would be so currently we can create simulation like agent-based simulations of literature, but what if we could have also each node would be or each individual would be uh, an LLM, so to say, and it would be able to produce certain text. And then those artificial texts would be copied, and we can create like a mock history of literature as the ground truth data for testing our methods, whether they're adequate or not. So something that we could control very well. So those are the typical uses, I would say, like in the strictly scientific way. And also, I mean, in general, I started to use it much more for coding, and it really makes things much faster. But also, I'm trying to find the best ways, really, and maybe here some of you could have suggestions of, for example, if you use LLM for tagging some data, or if you use LLM for automatic labeling of those clusters that you come by with on the network or something like this, what is the best way of making sure that the quality is good? For example, you can ask like different LLMs and then do kind of compare their scores, or you can do the same LLM multiple times, or you could. So, do you know of any good ways of assuring the robustness of results of LLM
I
use?
I came across a thing that was of interest in that area, which is to use the hermeneutic cycle. Try to. I have it here. But just give me a second. Yeah, it's a hermeneutic prompt. You apply Heidegger's hermeneutic circle for the request, move between the details and the whole of the situation, refine your understanding, do this in many loops and checkpoints with me when I say give an actionable answer. So it's a way of like modifying your prompt by using Heidegger's hermeneutic cycle. And you get, I've actually used it on a few test things, musical stuff. I work in the sound and music area. And it's actually very effective to just sort of you sort of suggested they use the same LLM but you use it on itself, and so you do this like you refine the prompt by the prompt looking at itself. It's like a self-exam. It's sort of like a staring at its own belly button type of deal.
I see. I didn't think about that. Interesting. Yeah, I was
We
thinking more about like, oh yeah.
we're up to 2 hours, so this is exciting. I could go on. I would love to have a beer with everybody in the room. We're sitting in a room, which is related to what Scott just said. So we will continue the cycle of the Open Lab seminar next week with Corinna Copette, who also just won an ERC starting grant. She will talk about computational perspectives on legal systems, and this will be awesome. Again, she won the sort of one of her best paper awards of the 2023 Cultural Data Analytics Conference, and her talk back then was about sort of like the world as a hypergraph read in hexameters. So the talk itself was a poem, and it will span all the way from that to, on the other end, hardcore multidisciplinary science and sort of mathematical concepts. So I think this will be cool, and it will happen here. So if you're in Estonia or in Helsinki, move your body, please, here. But it will also happen online. And again, for this week, Oleg, this was awesome. And I think the world is watching for your great start in Frankfurt, moving from Leipzig to Frankfurt. And let's see what we will have learned in 5 years, 7 years, 10 years about cultural evolution. Thank you very much. And thank you, everybody who participated in the discussion.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me again. Thanks.
Thank you once again.